Now, the number of people who've crossed the border from Ukraine has passed the 2 million mark in what is now regarded as the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Most of those fleeing have crossed into neighbouring EU countries. The speed of things is testing the resources and organizational capacity of the 5 countries on Ukraine's western border. A major relief effort is taking place, which takes in the work of local authorities and small and large refugee charities.
The trip was exhausting, but we're glad that we made it. There are a lot of people, but we had to wait a long time, I think 6 hours before we could get on the train, and it's all a little too crowded. I was really scared all the way because I read that a lot of people got shot when they were trying to leave the city, and Chernihiv is one of the cities where there are massive shots, and it was really scary.
Yes, it was a bit scary when I crossed the river Irpin. And there was shooting. It was a bit scary to cross the river because there was a flood and I had to walk on water. My legs were a bit wet and, in addition, they were shooting from the side from Stoyansk village and Bucha.
Well, we can cross live to Arise correspondent Adefemi Akinsanya, who was earlier on the border between Ukraine and Slovakia, and I understand now is on the Hungarian border. Good to see you, Femi. Just tell us more about what you've been seeing today.
Thank you, Charles. Well, what we've seen, the early part of the day was definitely spent on the Slovakian side of its border with Ukraine. And there was a very organized humanitarian response to the evacuees, to the refugees who were crossing into Slovakia. Once they first made landfall, as it were, onto the other side of the border, there was a plethora of resources available to them. First and foremost, women and children were offered immediate overnight accommodation, and they were able to have their identification taken by the people on the ground there and make themselves known and have their desires in terms of a place to stay the night taken immediately. In addition to that, there was huge outpouring of public support in terms of the donation of clothing, jackets, hats, scarves. It's very, very cold across this area of Eastern Europe. In addition to that, with those, many of them traveling with young children, there was the opportunity for them to take prams and baby carriers from the streets where those items were donated, which saved a lot of mothers from having to carry their young over the borderline. In addition to that, there was also a queue of coaches on deck ready to take as many refugees as possible into different parts of the country, whether or not they wanted to travel further and follow the route that we've taken across a border into Hungary, or whether they chose to stay put for the night. In addition to that, you did have the presence of private companies too, O2 and Orange, on ground, giving and registering people with SIM cards and giving them SIM cards that were already loaded with calling credit and around 15 gigabytes of data. So there was a huge commercial and humanitarian outpouring of support for the people crossing into Slovakia. Now, in addition to the other countries on the border, if we compare the presence in Slovakia compared to Poland, where there's a far greater number of refugees coming over, there's definitely more organization, probably because the Slovakian borders, the 5 of them, have are less likely to see the amount of numbers that we saw in Medica earlier on in the week and yesterday. So that seemed to be one of the reasons why the humanitarian response in Slovakia seemed to be a lot more organized than what we saw in countries like Poland.
And of course, Femi, we've been watching the attempts at these evacuation corridors in the 6 towns and cities in the east, and the more successful they are, obviously the more pressure there'll eventually be at the borders.
Exactly that. And that's what we're seeing from our time in Medica on the Polish side to what we saw in Slovakia, it was a continuous pouring of people coming over into the borders. We were told by some of the people on the ground there, the Slovakian border officials, that in the early parts of the morning they're less likely to see as many people as they saw yesterday. But from the entire time we were there, it was constantly in use. And as the time went on, as the days went on, we saw more and more people, more and more response. So as the success of these evacuation routes continues, it's likely that a plethora of these Eastern European countries, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, will continue to see itself hosting more and more refugees. And then that also brings up wider questions about the European response and how it is so much more warm and welcoming to the refugees of this Russia-Ukraine conflict, as opposed to earlier and more historical conflicts like the war in Syria, for example. Some people giving their ideas as to why the response is far warmer to Ukrainian refugees than it has been to refugees from other parts of the world. That being said, it still continues to be the status quo at a lot of these borders. The more these evacuation routes are successfully allowing people to cross over into safety, the more likely we'll continue to see people pouring into these Eastern European countries.
And Femi, we heard from you previously when you were in Poland. You were telling us about Africans, Indians and others, saying they're facing discrimination in their attempts to get across borders. The UNHCR says it's been speaking to regional governments and has received assurances that all nationalities in Ukraine are allowed to flee to safety. But are the border control officers taking heed of what the UN is saying?
It's very difficult at this point to know whether or not that has been implemented on the Ukrainian side. There's been a very small number of refugees of color that we've been able to see in the past couple of days at these different border crossings. But at Medica, I spoke to a Nigerian and he said that he hadn't faced any type of difficulty in getting to the border and crossing over. However, he was making his crossing 13 days into the conflict, and he had been living in Ukraine for 7 years, married to a Ukrainian woman, and they have a child together. Likewise, another Nigerian person I spoke to today, also been resident in Ukraine for a while, also in an interracial, international relationship. So what we heard at the very beginning of this conflict was a vast group of migrants and students of color struggling to get out of the country when the urgency was still very sudden and still very high. But as time has passed, 14 days into the conflict, with what we've seen at the border, there's first and foremost far less amount of refugees of color crossing, but the very few numbers that we have seen say that they have not faced any type of discrimination. It is worth noting that we are on our way to the Hungarian capital, where it's expected that more and more Nigerian students who have been evacuated from Sumy will successfully make their way to the Nigerian embassy there, and we are likely to be able to meet with them and ask them what their experience has been as it pertains to fleeing this war, and whether or not they have faced any type of discrimination, be it racial or otherwise.
Femi, I want to thank you very much indeed for your analysis there and your reporting. Adefemi Akinsanya is a RISE correspondent, and she's on the border there between Ukraine and Hungary.